Okay, here's what you're going to need for your Polaroid transfers. You're going to need your Polaroid film. You're going to need an X-Acto knife. You're going to need watercolor paper, something with a good bite and a lot of texture. An electric kettle. 2 darkroom trays. 1 for hot water, 1 for cold water. I suggest a variety of brushes in different hardnesses and softnesses, as well as a set of jewelry making tweezers. Alright, so first things first, the first thing you want to do in your Polaroid emulsion transfer process is to, I cut this down previously, but you want to make sure you have your cut paper ready to go. Then what you're going to do is you're going to take your X-Acto knife or box cutter, either one, and you're going to cut on the front right along the white frame edge, making sure you get through the plastic on the front and the back. And when you're doing that, then you're going to lift the image out. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quickly. We're through. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this over, and we've got this black backing. What we want to do is peel that black backing off, because it's just plastic. It's an opaque plastic surface for the image to pop more on, so we're just going to peel that right off. And we're going to be left with our image cut out and just the white, it's kind of powdery substance on the back. It will start to bubble and peel up once it's placed in hot water. As that water comes to a boil, I like to get all of my supplies that I'm going to be using to remove the backing of the Polaroid and the surface that I'm going to transfer it on. Now the water's boiling, I usually like to let it drop just below boiling before I pour it into my tray. Pour my water in until I have enough water in to submerge both my paper and my Polaroid. So now that our hot water's in, I'm going to go ahead and put my Polaroid face down in the water, because I want to be removing on the back because it's covered in a plastic in the front, and we'll remove that. It just is clear plastic. It's got some chemical on it, some jelly, and the hot water is what separates your image from this piece of plastic. So as that sits in there, I'm going to then go ahead and drop my watercolor paper, and it will buckle and bend with the heat until it's fully submerged. So we're going to go ahead and fully submerge that just by pushing down on it with a brush. It's very similar to working in a darkroom and darkroom processes from back during the film and analog days. And now that that is sitting and soaking, it helps because the fibers loosen up too and makes the paper actually have more bite, and it helps the Polaroid grab onto it a little better. So now that that has sat for a minute, I'm going to grab my brush and I'm going to slowly start from one corner, and let me get this in frame here because you guys can't see it, and slowly start to kind of just make waves in the water, slightly touching the emulsion, and it starts to lift up. You can see that stuff starting to flake off there. You keep removing this. I think I've gotten most of it off there, of all this white dusty substance, and then I'm going to start just slowly touching the image and removing the Polaroid from the backing. I go around the edges to try and get as much intact as possible. Sometimes you have to switch up direction and it starts to peel back. Now, as the Polaroid is older, it will tend to have a tendency to like bunch up more, but you can always straighten it out later. Now I'm not sure if you can see right here, there's like this clear jelly substance. We're also separating the Polaroid from that, because that's the adhesive and the glue, the chemical they use to attach it to this piece of plastic, and I'll show you what I'm talking about and a close-up of it in just a minute as soon as I finish doing this. My tweezers, you can see the goopiness that is on that plastic that the image used to be attached to. We want to make sure all of that comes off on the color image. It sort of just dissolves on a black and white image. Black and whites are a little different than color. You actually end up with like a transparent, like almost a transparency to the image. So now the image is lifted and my water has cooled through setting up my camera, and we can see how we can move the image. Sometimes I'll use tweezers for this, but you also get tears. So a lot of times I'll use my brush and just I'll brush all this up together as an image onto the paper, and then I'll start working on how to get it apart. Now, when it's all clumped together like this is where tweezers can really become really helpful, and to move it all together. We just want to make sure that we keep it under the surface of the water, because when you pull it up, it becomes rigid really fast, and that's when it really starts to tear. So right now, it just looks like a clump of stuff, but as we start to unravel it and unclump it, we can start to see our image take shape. So right there is exactly how I was talking. Once it starts to come above the water, it becomes very rigid very fast. So I try to do all of my manipulation while keeping it under the surface of the water. You can even use your fingers for this. I find it's probably from years of working with product and photographing jewelry, but I find that these tweezers and other objects allow me a little bit more control. And really, to be honest, I find the hardest part of this whole process actually getting the image centered and untangling it, which is what I'm doing right now. Sometimes you have to pull it one way and then pull it back another. You just have to mess with it, and you can mess with it for quite a long time. As your water starts to cool, your image will start to become more rigid and less flexible, so and your emulsion becomes a little more fragile. But as long as it's in warm water, you can manipulate it pretty easily. As you can see, like I said, when it starts to tear, it'll continue that tear on that same plane a lot easier. So we're getting somewhere where I think we're pretty good. What I like to do now is try and get my image as centered as possible. Sometimes that's with the brush and other instances. So as I start to pull, I'm going to start pulling up and lifting my paper out of the water. And as I do that, I'm going to grab the corner of the spot and let it kind of wrinkle, because sometimes I think that can be really help share the properties of water. And you have these pieces that curl under, and we're going to work on fixing that next to get a more complete image, because when you're shooting a landscape, you lose too much of the landscape. It's not really about what, and you sort of lose your subject. So I got it pulled up, it's pretty centered. You can manipulate here with the brush some. I just always try to make sure I dip my brush in the water first, because if I don't, I'll pull pieces up like that. Now we have this little rolled up piece here. I'm gonna try and fix that, but it's gonna be a process. So I want to put the bottom in because I want it to unroll from under there. I'm gonna dip it back in the water. As I do that, my image is gonna lift again. And then I'm gonna sort of hold this guy because I like that island there. But I'm gonna try and just push it in and pull it out kind of quick. And it will start to unroll that piece, and just tore it a little more there. Shit. Sometimes that happens. As you can tell, like I said, the older the Polaroid is, the more fragile it becomes, but we can kind of level it out just a little bit here. Some really light touches, small movements, because if it's not level there, it doesn't quite look level on the image, and just a couple little stylistic touches. And that is essentially how you do your Polaroid emulsion transfer. From here, we would take and dip it in the cold water. That's an optional thing. Sometimes I just take my brush and take cold water and drip it on top and let it run, and it'll help things sort of stick a little more and allow the Polaroid to become a little more rigid again. And help it hold the shape that you wanted it to hold when you got it on there. And you can still, like I said, you can like tip the Polaroid, the water, and still mess with it as it becomes more rigid, which is also can be really fun. So I like to just dip my paintbrush in the cold water and start dabbling cold water around the edges, and let the water kind of run through and under the Polaroid and cool down the paper. And then I'm going to want to take this, set it on a towel or a bed of paper towels out of direct sunlight, away from heat, so it can just dry naturally and slowly, because we don't want the paper to buckle or anything like that as it dries. And that's essentially how you do a Polaroid emulsion transfer.